At age 53, Chipper Jones exists as one of the most enduring and rarest icons of modern American baseball. A man who built his entire legacy in nothing but the Atlanta Braves uniform for nearly 2 decades without ever leaving. He was the #1 overall pick in the MLB draft, the foundation of a dynasty that dominated the National League East, a constant presence in the most intense postseason runs of the 1990s and 2000s. Chipper Jones won the World Series in 1995, claimed the NL MVP in 1999 with numbers that humbled the entire league, earned 8 All-Star selections, 2 Silver Sluggers, and finished his career with over 2,700 hits, 468 home runs, and more than 1,600 RBI. He is the greatest switch hitter in MLB history, a third baseman whom experts regard as the absolute standard of consistency, intelligence, and effectiveness. When inducted into the Hall of Fame with near-unanimous votes, Chipper Jones was recognized not just for his achievements, but for his rare loyalty and an unwavering sense of responsibility in the face of the relentless performance pressure of American professional sports. But as that spotlight faded, what remained was not the roar of crowds, but a body worn down to its very core. At age 53, his mornings begin with a dull ache in his back, knees stiffening as though every joint carries the memory of thousands of slides, twists and unforgiving collisions. It is not sudden pain, but the kind that accumulates over years, the pain of a man taught that enduring is duty and silence is virtue. Chipper Jones played through pain, delayed surgeries, switched positions, traded personal pride to stay on the field, because he believed his job was never to break, no matter the cost. Even after his career ended, that will did not vanish. It transformed into the way he now slows down, faces his body's limits without complaint, and accepts that true greatness lies not in avoiding suffering, but in continuing to move forward when no one is cheering anymore, when it is just him and the resolve not to let old praise become an excuse to give up. If Chipper Jones's story makes you pause and see the price of greatness differently, please hit subscribe to keep joining us for deeper chapters of his life. Chipper Jones's childhood was not marked by loud tragedies or material deprivation, but by a prolonged quiet and persistent silence, like the air he grew up breathing in the orderly homes of the American South, where order was foundation, discipline was principle, and affection was rarely considered necessary. His family was not cold in the sense of neglect, but it was never warm in the way that makes a child feel unconditionally sheltered. Everything had its place, its time, its standard, and in that world, love existed as something obvious yet unspoken, untouched, and certainly unexplained. Chipper's father embodied that philosophy most clearly, a man who believed a son's worth was measured by what he accomplished, that achievement was the only language needed, and that silence in the face of emotion was not a flaw but a mark of strength. Praise was rare, not out of cruelty, but because he believed compliments weaken people, and that very restraint, seemingly harmless, gradually became the mold that shaped Chipper Jones's entire life. In that house, no one said the boy was unloved, but no one said he was loved enough to be allowed to be weak either. There were no long talks about fear, no questions about disappointment, only nods when things were done right and silence when they fell short. Chipper learned very early that emotions were to be kept private, that if you were sad the best thing was to swallow it, if you hurt then keep moving forward, because the world doesn't stop for a boy to figure himself out. At school he wasn't the most standout kid, not the star teachers remembered by name, and that ordinariness only deepened the feeling that he had to try twice as hard just to be seen, even if no one ever said it outright. Instead of rebelling, Chipper chose to adapt, and that adaptation took the form of a quiet, obedient boy, who always tried to do things right, who carried pressure alone without seeking to share it, because he had learned that asking for comfort wasn't among the acceptable options. It was in that atmosphere that the seed of a professional mentality was planted, not as a career strategy, but as a survival mechanism: do better to avoid disappointment, stay quieter to avoid bothering anyone, be stronger to need no rescue. Love in Chipper's family was never fully withheld, but it was given sparingly, conditionally, and often later than a growing child's need, leaving in him a nameless void, not a lack of care, but a lack of being recognized simply for existing. That void didn't turn Chipper into a rebellious child, it turned him into someone who always wondered if he was good enough yet, and that question, never answered with words or hugs, quietly followed him through the years of growing up, becoming the drive that wouldn't let him stop, wouldn't let him weaken, and wouldn't let his heart rest even when his body began to tire. That part of his childhood didn't create a victim, it created a man accustomed to living within frames, to enduring in silence, and to trading emotion for stability, only for that very familiarity, many years later when the stadium lights went out, to become the deep root of tragedy, a man who learned to defeat every opponent, but was never taught how to face and heal himself. The moment Chipper Jones's name was called as the #1 overall draft pick didn't arrive like an explosion of celebration, but like a door closing behind a young man who hadn't yet fully grasped the meaning of the word honor. From that second, Atlanta no longer saw him as a person still growing, but as the team's future, a cold concept capable of swallowing every mistake, every hesitation, every moment of weakness. The city, after seasons of waiting, placed on his shoulders the faith of the stands, the front office, the long-term plans where every number was drawn around the name Chipper Jones, and from then on, his life was redefined by expectation. The #1 pick wasn't just a scouting choice, it was a commitment that the chosen one would not be allowed to break, that he would stand firm so others could lean on him, that he would be right even while still learning to grow up. From that moment, Chipper no longer had the ordinary right to be wrong as a young human being. Every small error was magnified into a question of character, every off day seen as a threat to the shared future, and every acknowledged pain interpreted as a lack of toughness. He entered the organization as the franchise cornerstone, a title that sounded glorious but carried an invisible demand: carry it all, even things that never belonged to one person. In those first practices, in the eyes of the coaches and veterans, Chipper quickly understood that no one was waiting for him to mature slowly. He had to be ready immediately, had to prove the #1 choice was correct, and had to do it in silence, without complaining, without asking for time. That pressure didn't come as a blow, but as a slow draining current, day after day eroding the last traces of innocence, turning every morning into a test, every step onto the field into a suspended verdict, either right or not enough. Chipper learned very quickly not to allow himself to be weak, because weakness meant betraying trust, and in American sports culture, betraying trust is the gravest sin. He also learned not to allow himself to collapse, because the collapse of someone called the future would bring panic to the entire system. So step by step, the person behind the name was compressed to make room for the role, the symbol, the responsibility he never asked for but was forced to carry. In those years, few people asked Chipper Jones what he felt. They only asked if he was ready, if he had delivered, if he had proven enough. And when no questions were asked of emotion, emotion gradually became something to be put away. The #1 pick, therefore, didn't just open a career path, it branded his life with a ruthless principle. From now on, his value would be measured by consistency, not by the truth inside. Every time he stepped onto the field with the Atlanta logo on his chest, Chipper didn't just represent the team, he represented a promise signed with his youth, a promise that he would stand firm so others could feel secure, that he would endure pain so the system could run smoothly, and that he would not claim the right to be wrong even though he knew being wrong is inevitable for any human being. It was here that the destined tragedy began to take clear shape. Honor became a sentence, and the chosen boy no longer lived for himself, but lived to fulfill a pre-drawn future where there was no room for fragility, no space to slow down, and no right for his heart to rest even as his body began learning how to endure. Entering Major League Baseball, Chipper Jones did not step into a glittering dream, but into a world where pain was the common language, something everyone understood but no one was allowed to speak aloud, especially not a player carrying the label of draft #1 and the future of the team. His early years in MLB were not defined by one fateful injury, but by a chain of small recurring hurts, mild enough not to force him to stop, yet persistent enough to wear down every muscle fiber, every joint, every morning upon waking. There were fleeting back pains that returned, knees that swelled slightly after every long series, muscles that tightened in ways people called normal at this level, and in that environment, the word normal meant acceptance. The clubhouse culture was never written into law, but everyone understood the one who complains of pain lacks toughness, the one who asks for rest isn't ready to carry responsibility, and the number one pick has even less right to show fragility. Chipper learned to smile when asked, "You good?" Learned to nod when the coach eyed him appraisingly, and learned to force his body to keep functioning, even when it was sending very clear warning signals. In that world, pain was not a reason to stop, it was part of the job, an invisible cost players accepted to stay on the field. He was not the only one hurting, but unlike many others, Chipper carried the extra burden of expectation, turning every ache not just into a medical issue, but into a question of character, of worthiness for the position he held. So instead of listening to his body, he learned to override it. Instead of seeking full recovery, he chose temporary fixes to keep playing, because every pause carried the fear that his spot, his role, the city's trust might waver. In those first seasons, no one called it sacrifice, they called it professionalism, competitive spirit, the quality needed to survive at the top. And Chipper Jones, raised with a childhood accustomed to hiding emotions and shouldering pressure alone, accepted that philosophy as self-evident, even as confirmation that he was on the right path. But it was here that the seed of physical destruction was planted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like accumulating debt, each game a small loan taken from his own future. Every time he took the field not fully healed, every time he chose to endure instead of stopping, his body learned another dangerous lesson, that it could be forced, that its limits could be pushed back, and that pain signals did not necessarily have to be respected. For Chipper, that choice did not come from recklessness, but from responsibility, from the obsession to be right, to be steady, to be the anchor for the entire team. He sought no pity, asked for no special treatment, demanded no different handling, because in his mind, doing so would mean admitting he wasn't tough enough for the role he'd been given. So those early MLB years passed in the familiar rhythm of playing, temporary recovery, then playing again, a loop that made pain a constant background noise, familiar enough to ignore, dangerous enough to never disappear. There was no single moment that clearly marked the start of this tragedy, because it didn't begin with a fall or a surgery, but with hundreds of small reasonable decisions at the time that were ruthless to the future. Looking back, it becomes clear that Chipper Jones was not broken by MLB, he was worn down by the very philosophy that helped him survive, one that treated endurance as obvious, silence as strength, and continuing to take the field no matter the cost, as the only way to prove he deserved everything placed on his shoulders, the day his name was called number one. The first glory came to Chipper Jones, like a massive wave sweeping away every lingering doubt, and in the eyes of the American public at that moment, the story seemed complete. The number one draft pick had proven his worth, Atlanta's future had become the present, and baseball had found a perfect icon. The numbers didn't lie. The MVP award, the World Series title, the seasons where the name Chipper Jones was synonymous with absolute consistency and showing up exactly when the team needed him most. On the stands, people saw a confident, composed man, a quiet leader who didn't need flash, a player every team dreamed of and every city proudly claimed as its symbol. The media praised his rapid maturity, called him the standard of professionalism, living proof that pressure could forge diamonds. At that moment, no one doubted that Chipper Jones had conquered both baseball and his own fate, but that glory, brilliant and filled with cheers, carried a deceptive nature that only those standing very close could feel. It lit up the surface, but left thick darkness behind. When the season ended, and the championship banners were hung, Chipper's body had begun sending signals that could no longer be ignored, pains that no longer appeared only after games, but crept into daily life, mornings waking with unexplained fatigue, as though his body had been depleted far beyond what the achievements allowed people to admit. But in the world where he stood, no one wanted to hear about overload. Victory was always the strongest proof to dismiss any complaint, and Chipper as MVP understood that any sign of weakness would be seen as unworthy of the glory he held. So he kept going, as he had been accustomed since those early MLB years, kept playing, kept enduring, kept placing duty above his body's needs, because absolute fame did not permit a man to stop just because he felt pain. Alongside the physical wear was the first cracks in his private life, cracks the public never saw because the stadium lights were too bright. The grueling schedule, endless travel, the pressure to always be at peak performance pulled Chipper further from family space, not out of irresponsibility, but because he had never been taught how to balance professional duty with emotional presence. His marriage began to bear quiet strains, conversations postponed, silences stretching on with no one knowing where to start repairing them. While the public celebrated the image of a perfect icon, inside his home that perfection gradually became pressure, because it left no room for fatigue, for doubt, for the moments of vulnerability a relationship needs acknowledged to survive. Chipper Jones, who could face the harshest pitchers in the league, fumbled before questions with no scorecard, no stats, and no absolutely correct answer. Success in this phase did not heal those gaps, it only temporarily drowned the cries of pain with applause, with glowing articles, with the feeling that everything was on track because the on-field results were so convincing. But every time the lights went out, every time he returned in silence, the pains remained, both in body and mind, reminding him that winning did not equal peace. The first glory, instead of becoming a foundation to pause and reflect, became the drive that pushed Chipper further beyond his limits, because once at the peak, the greatest fear was no longer failure, but losing the image of invincibility others had assigned him. He continued living in the role of icon, continued meeting expectations, continued bearing the warning signs his body sent, because in the world of champions, no one teaches you how to listen while you're winning. From the outside, this was the most glorious period of Chipper Jones's career, a string of achievements enough to etch his name into American baseball history. But from the inside, it was also the time when the seeds of pain were watered by success itself, growing silently and waiting for the day they would be seen. The MVP and World Series fulfilled their mission as titles, but they could not do what no title can teach a man: how to stop and heal, how to admit that glory, no matter how brilliant, cannot replace the wholeness of the human being behind it. Chipper Jones's first marriage did not collapse amid loud arguments or sensational headlines, but dissolved in silence, the familiar silence that had followed him from childhood to the MLB clubhouse, and now seeped into the private space he had never learned to protect. There was no scandal for the public to dissect, no defenses for the media to quote, only two people gradually drifting apart, because of a cold reality. Baseball had claimed the best parts of him before his family could realize what they needed. Those years Chipper lived in the relentless rhythm of the schedule, red-eye flights, long practices, and the pressure to always be present as a pillar that could not afford to falter. He brought home not cruelty, but exhaustion, not anger, but an absence that stretched into habit. For Chipper, completing the mission on the field was always the unquestioned priority, because that was where he knew what to do, how he was judged, and that effort would be measured by concrete results. In contrast, married life demanded a skill he had never been taught: emotional presence, listening without a right answer, admitting fatigue when it could not be converted into victory. The rare evenings at home brought no real replenishment, because between them lay distance created by things left unsaid, expectations never voiced, and the sense that baseball, unintentionally, had become a more loyal companion than anyone else. Chipper was not heartless, he was simply a man accustomed to solving every problem with discipline and silence, two tools effective on the field, but powerless against wounds that needed to be named. When the cracks began to show clearly, he sought no public explanation, no way to blame circumstances or his profession, because deep down he understood this breakdown had no clear villain. It was the consequence of a life arranged so completely around professional duty that no room remained for the softness needed to nurture a family. The divorce came as a sad but unsurprising conclusion, accepted in silence by both sides, as though everyone knew no one lost in a moral sense, but no one truly won at keeping what mattered most. To the public, this story barely existed. Chipper Jones's image remained tied to clutch hits and the calm demeanor of a champion. But to him this was the first family tragedy, the moment success could not shield, where he was forced to face the truth that some losses cannot be offset by titles. No one cheers for the loser in battles like these, because they don't play out before crowds, have no scoreboard to decide, and offer no easy lessons to draw. Chipper kept playing, kept fulfilling his role, because that was what he did best. But from that point on, baseball was no longer just a career. It became the last refuge from questions he wasn't ready to answer. That silent collapse of his marriage did not turn Chipper bitter or resentful, but left in him a dull cut, reminding him that presence cannot be replaced by effort from afar, and that some parts of life do not accept arriving late, no matter how valid the reason. In the journey of a man accustomed to winning, this was the first time he tasted irreversible defeat, a loss with no chance to correct, and from there private tragedy began to run parallel to glory, quietly but persistently, waiting for the moment to face the light. The unforgivable mistake of Chipper Jones did not arrive with the crash of a public scandal, was not torn apart by the media day after day, did not turn him into a hunted figure on the front pages, but it cut deeper than any storm of public opinion, because it unfolded in a space of silence where he could no longer hide behind achievements or professional discipline. It was the story of a child born outside the bounds of marriage, a truth that could not be softly named, could not be explained by work pressure, and certainly could not be shielded by the halo of a sports icon. To the public, this might have been just a short news item, a fleeting piece of information not strong enough to shake the image of a player already so accustomed to being respected. But for Chipper, it was the deepest cut, because for the first time in his life, he could not invoke professional duty to justify the consequences of a personal choice. He did not deny the child, did not turn his back, did not seek to evade responsibility, and that very fact made this tragedy even heavier, because once he chose to face it, there was no other path except to live with the truth every single day. The silence surrounding this story was not an image strategy, but the reflex of a man accustomed to shouldering his mistakes alone, rather than bringing them into the light. A man who believed that taking responsibility quietly was the only way to preserve the little order left in a life already filled with too much pressure. But silence did not mean relief. It carried guilt, the kind of guilt that was not loud but persistent, appearing in seemingly harmless moments, in the reflection of his own face whenever the familiar features of a father stared back with a question never spoken aloud. Had he done the right thing, and was there anything that could ever be fully repaired? Shame came too, not shame before the public, but before the very moral standard he had set for himself from the day he entered MLB, the standard of a man who carries responsibility, does not evade, does not blame others, and does not let his mistakes hurt anyone else. In this case, Chipper understood there was no way for that mistake not to cause harm, that acknowledging and caring for it could only lessen the consequences, never erase the cause. The feeling of failure as a person crept into the spaces once occupied solely by physical exhaustion, because this was not a bad swing that could be made up for in the next at-bat, not a poor season that could be redeemed with an MVP, but a moral marker with no do-over button. Chipper kept playing, kept showing up with his familiar calm demeanor, kept doing what he did best, but inside, the confidence built on discipline and consistency began to crack, not because he feared being exposed, but because he knew exactly what he had done and could not convince himself it was just a fleeting error. On red-eye flights, in quiet hotel rooms, when the noise of the ballpark had faded, that story returned like a wordless reminder, forcing him to confront a version of himself untrained to win, unconditioned to endure, one that could only learn to live with the aftermath. His refusal to speak publicly, to redefine the narrative, to turn it into an inspirational lesson for others, reflected his most consistent personal choice. This was not something to tell, but something to carry. And carrying here meant not just material responsibility or fatherly duty, but accepting that the image of the steadfast man he had built throughout his career now bore a crack he could no longer hide from himself. This moral tragedy did not cause Chipper to collapse, but it changed how he viewed everything around him, from the concept of success to the meaning of endurance. It taught him that some pains cannot be trained away, cannot be toughened up over time, and cannot be healed simply by performing better in another role. While the stadium lights illuminated a perfect icon, few knew that behind it was a man learning to live with the feeling of personal failure, not through loud confession, but through quiet presence and relentless effort, not to repeat the mistake, even knowing that cut would always be there, reminding him of the price of those moments of weakness in a life too accustomed to never allowing himself to be weak. Chipper Jones's body betrayed him not with a dramatic fall or a moment that forced him to stop under the lights, but with slow, ruthless erosion, where every game gradually turned into a prolonged torture he still forced himself to enter, as though it were an inescapable duty. Chronic back pain appeared first, not fierce but persistent, a constant tightness ready to flare with every twist, bend or explosive movement after a swing, and over time it became the ever-present soundtrack of his playing life, familiar enough to ignore, serious enough to never go away. Then came the knees, joints bearing the heavy load of thousands of pivots, slides, landings, beginning an irreversible decline, swelling after long series, stiffening every morning upon waking, reminding him that the body forgets none of the debts it was forced to carry. Strains, tears became unwanted companions, recurring so often that recovery schedules became mere temporary math, enough to get him back on the field, but never enough for true healing. In the world of MLB, where schedules do not wait, and teams need their cornerstones present, drastic solutions like surgery always meant disappearance, leaving a gap others would fill, and for Chipper Jones, who had lived his entire life as the anchor, that thought was nearly unacceptable, so he delayed, time after time, opting for pain injections, half measures of physical therapy, and adjusted workouts to keep playing, because in his mind, responsibility to the team outweighed medical advice, and standing on the sidelines while teammates fought was something he had not been taught to endure. Every game, therefore, was no longer pure competitive joy, but a silent chain of painful decisions. Should he swing harder, or hold back a little for his back? Should he dive for the ball or let it drop? Should he run full speed or save the knees for later innings? Those questions flashed in split seconds amid the cheers and the unforgiving pace of the game, and each time he chose to push forward, his body recorded another mark of force. Chipper did not play in full health, he played in a state of never being healed, a limbo where pain was not enough to force a stop, but more than enough to gradually destroy every natural limit. There were days he took the field feeling like his body was a disjointed mass held together by tape and willpower, nights back at the hotel taking tens of minutes just to stand upright from a chair, mornings needing far longer to warm up for ordinary life than for a full 9-inning game. But the most tragic part was not the physical pain alone, but the distorted relationship that formed between him and his own body, where the body was no longer listened to as a partner to protect, but treated as a tool that must obey. In that environment, pain was not seen as a warning signal, but as proof of dedication, and every time Chipper stepped onto the field not fully healed, he received respect, praise, and the feeling that he was doing what needed to be done, even as the bill was deferred to the future. That future, at the time, seemed too distant to worry about, because the present still held games to win, seasons to complete, expectations to meet. No one saw the full picture in those moments, not even him, because pain, when fragmented into small aches and separate injuries, is very easy to underestimate. Chipper Jones was not destroyed by one single injury, he was worn down by the cumulative weight of hundreds of decisions to continue when he should have stopped, by the belief that enduring was an inevitable part of the role he had accepted. As seasons followed seasons, and his reputation grew ever more solid, his body became increasingly a land of compromises, where there was no full recovery, only good enough to play, and that very state stretched year after year, laid the foundation for the deepest physical tragedy of Chipper's life. A man who spent most of his youth proving he would not break, only to discover, when he needed a whole body to step into life after the field, that he had prepaid that price with every cautious step, every dull ache, and every morning waking to the realization that his body, at last, was speaking up to reclaim everything it had once been forced to silence. Switching positions to survive was a decision Chipper Jones never wanted to make, because for a player who had built his entire professional identity at third base, leaving that position was not just a technical change, it was a painful concession of pride, a silent admission that his body could no longer meet the harshest demands of the role that had once defined his greatness. Chipper did not move to the outfield out of a hunger for new challenges, nor because of some calculated long-term strategy, but because it was the only remaining compromise between his desire to stay on the field and the harsh reality of knees, back, and tendons worn down to the point they could no longer withstand the reflexes and collisions unique to third base. In the world of professional baseball, where position is tied to value and reputation, such a shift is often seen as a step back, and Chipper understood that clearly. He knew that every step into the outfield was a step further from the standard image he had etched his name into for so many years. But the choice was not fully in his hands, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping when he wasn't ready was something he had never learned to accept. Switching positions, therefore, did not bring relief from pain. It only changed the form of endurance. The outfield demanded fewer quick reactions close to the ground, but it lengthened runs, increased load on already weakened parts, turning every sprint into a new test for knees and lower back. Chipper knew very well that he was not healing, but merely prolonging a body already broken, trying to squeeze the last remnants of athletic ability in exchange for more playing time, more chances to contribute, more seasons that might help stabilize the team. This sacrifice was never announced as a heroic act. There was no speech about dedication, no public moment of pride. It happened quietly, amid adjusted practices, brief talks with coaches, and an inner acceptance that personal honor sometimes had to yield to harsh reality. Chipper did not complain, did not resent, because for him continuing to be present, even in a less glamorous role, was better than standing outside watching his team fight without being able to help. But every time he stepped into the outfield, he felt the difference clearly: the fans' gazes, the shift in game rhythm, and the quiet sense of loss when he no longer stood at the position that had once been his domain. The honor of a great third baseman did not vanish, but it was folded away, stored, making room for the only goal left surviving season after season. That continuation was not blind stubbornness, but the result of a long process of self-persuasion, where Chipper constantly weighed the cost of stopping against the cost of going on, ultimately choosing the path that hurt less in his own way, even knowing neither was easy. In this decision to change positions, one sees the clearest symbol of silent sacrifice, not because he wanted recognition, but because he would not allow himself to leave the game while he could still contribute, even if that ability had been limited by his previous sacrifices. Chipper Jones continued, not because he believed his body would recover, but because he believed his responsibility had not yet ended, and in that belief, he accepted trading yet another piece of personal honor to extend his presence on the field, even as every game increasingly resembled an endless negotiation between will and pain. Retirement came to Chipper Jones, not with an explosive moment or a carefully prepared decision to close a legend, but with the prolonged silence after the final applause faded away, the silence he had never learned to face. For nearly 2 decades, baseball had been the armor shielding every wound, the legitimate reason to endure pain, to delay healing, to justify absence from personal life. When that armor was removed, Chipper had nowhere left to hide, no more schedule to cling to, no more clubhouse to share the burden, and no more familiar rhythm to help him forget the unanswered questions. The silence suddenly became the enemy, because in it echoed everything that had once been pushed back by victory: emptiness, regret, and the feeling that so many years had passed that could never be reclaimed. The body, accustomed to pain for a clear purpose, now hurt without purpose. The back still ached, the knees still stiffened, but no game waited to turn that pain into meaningful sacrifice. Chipper realized a bitter truth: when baseball left, the pain did not leave with it, and worse, there was no longer any reason strong enough to accept its existence. Mornings upon waking were no longer defined by last night's game or tomorrow's practice, but by a suffocating emptiness where he was forced to face himself as a human being, not as a player. In that emptiness, regret crept into every corner: relationships not nurtured, family moments missed, times he chose to keep playing instead of stopping to heal. Regret did not arrive as a final verdict, but as repeated questions without right answers, asking whether all those sacrifices were truly necessary, and whether there was anything more valuable that he had unknowingly traded away. With no more baseball to shield him, Chipper also lost the only structure he had ever relied on to understand who he was. For years, his identity had been tied to position, to statistics, to his role on the team. Now, with those things in the past, he had to relearn how to exist without a scorecard to confirm his worth. That transition was not gentle. It brought a sense of being lost, as though he had left a world with clear rules for a space where success and failure were no longer measured by numbers. Those around him continued their lives. New seasons began without him, and Chipper felt keenly that time did not pause to wait for a legend to find himself again. The silence in this phase was not the deserved rest after a great career, but a harsh mental trial, forcing him to listen to thoughts that had once only flashed by before being drowned out by cheers. He began to confront the lost years in an unavoidable way, realizing that always placing duty above emotion had helped him succeed in sports, but left him unprepared for life after the field. No coach taught how to retire without losing yourself. No curriculum guided how to live when the biggest goal had been achieved. Chipper had to grope through that darkness on his own, learning to accept that emptiness was not a sign of failure, but the natural consequence of a life built around a single role. In that inner collapse, he did not fall publicly, did not seek attention, but endured quietly, just as he had endured physical pain throughout his career. But unlike before, there were no stands to cheer, no victories to soothe, and no clear promise of tomorrow. Only a man who had to learn to live with himself, with the memory of glory and its price, and with the truth that silence, when no longer drowned out by roars, could become the greatest enemy if not faced with honesty and acceptance. Fatherhood came to Chipper Jones not at the strongest point of his life, but when he already carried a weary body, and a mind filled with things he had not yet had time to fix. After baseball left, when the cheers no longer covered the inner emptiness, the role of father emerged more clearly than ever, not glamorous, no titles, and allowing no delay. Chipper entered that calling with sincerity, but also with a quiet burden, realizing he could not turn back time to make up for the lost years, the missed moments when his career always came first. Becoming a father when already tired meant every morning began with familiar pains, but this time not to prepare for a game, but to prepare for a day that required patience, presence, and listening. He no longer had the boundless energy of youth, no longer the explosive drive to charge forward without looking back, and that very fact made fatherhood a journey both gentle and painful. Gentle because he cherished every small moment, every conversation, every time being with his children without having to rush away. Painful, because each of those moments also reminded him of the gaps in the past that could never be filled. Chipper realized a hard truth: love for his children could not erase old choices, and presence in the now could not fully compensate for previous absences. Instead of trying to become a perfect role model, he chose a humbler path, learning to be with his children as a flawed human being, ready to admit fatigue, ready to apologize when needed, and ready to listen without trying to control. Regret did not disappear, it remained like an undercurrent, reminding him that fatherhood was not a chance to fully redeem mistakes, but an invitation to live differently, slower, more honestly. Chipper no longer believed in grand gestures or powerful declarations. He believed in the steady consistency of presence, in being there when his children needed him, even when his body ached or his spirit was weary. In those quiet moments, he learned that true strength lay not in endless endurance, but in daring to change the rhythm of life to avoid repeating the same cycle of sacrifice. Fatherhood amid regret was not a sentence, but a belated learning journey, where every day was a chance to choose differently, not to repair the past, but to stop losing the present. For Chipper Jones, this was the softest yet most persistent form of tragedy, because it did not scream, did not shatter, but quietly reshaped how he understood responsibility, love, and the meaning of being there for those who matter, when no stage remained to hide his own shortcomings. The Hall of Fame came to Chipper Jones as an undeniable confirmation of the career he had traded nearly his entire youth for. But that moment of honor carried an unnamed sense of belatedness, because when the applause rang out, his body was no longer a home for untainted joy. Standing before Cooperstown, Among the icons of American baseball history, Chipper was no longer the young man carrying the pressure of draft number 1 or the leader gritting his teeth through pain to drag the team forward. He was a man who had endured enough losses to understand that glory, no matter how deserved, had no right to erase the price it had demanded. The praise for his lifelong loyalty to Atlanta, for his rare switch hitting, for his consistent seasons amid fierce competition, poured in like a perfect summation. But in his chest, the heartbeat was not the exhilaration others imagined. It was subdued, heavy, because every compliment also dragged up memories of mornings when his back hurt too much to bend, knees that locked before he could walk, decisions to continue when he should have stopped. Being honored when the body was already broken was a paradox hard to swallow. History called your name at the right time, but the body no longer had the strength to fully enjoy the moment. Chipper smiled, spoke calmly, thanked teammates, family, and fans, but behind that composure was a clear awareness that the honor did not soothe the now chronic pain, did not return the sacrificed years, and could not restore the depleted energy. The final rounds of applause carried a different tone from the cheers on the field. They were deeper, longer, but also more distant, because they were for a journey already closed. When the crowd dispersed, Chipper returned to a slower rhythm of life, where standing up or sitting down required calculation, where trips had to be carefully weighed, and where joy no longer came from stadium lights, but from simple presence with family. The glory was incomplete not because the Hall of Fame was undeserved, but because its timing laid bare the full truth. The career had been etched into history, but the body and mind had paid the price before the heart could rest. Chipper did not resent the induction, nor did he question its value. He simply saw it as the final marker in a chain of prices long since paid. Some enter the Hall of Fame with a sense of triumph, able to celebrate, travel, enjoy. For Chipper it was a quiet moment, where he realized the deepest meaning of recognition lay not in being hailed, but in looking back at the entire road traveled without evasion. The applause, no matter how thunderous, could not replace healing, but it gave him something else: acknowledgement that the silent sacrifices, the painful decisions, and the years of endurance had not been forgotten. The belated honor was therefore not a failure. It was a confirmation that arrived when all illusions had fallen away, allowing Chipper to accept it with the humility of a man who understood that the greatest victory no longer lay on the scoreboard, but in the ability to keep living with the full truth of what was lost and what remained. The legacy of Chipper Jones does not need to be built by sanctifying a person or making excuses for choices that caused harm, because the most enduring value in his journey lies in straightforward acknowledgement and responsibility, without evasion. As time recedes, the numbers and titles gradually become background. What remains is a far more complex portrait, a man who erred, who endured, and who did not flee from the consequences of his own actions. Chipper did not try to rewrite the story to make it prettier. He allowed the dark patches to exist alongside the light, because only then does a legacy truly reflect the real price of greatness. He did not deny the damage his career inflicted on his body, nor did he evade moral responsibility in his personal life. Instead, he chose to keep living with the truth, without blaming circumstances, without using professional pressure as a permanent shield. Redefining the legend, in this case, is not about diminishing achievements, but about placing them in their proper position within the life of a limited human being. Chipper understood that being remembered as a loyal player, a rare switch hitter, an icon of Atlanta, only truly matters when it does not obscure the hard lessons about responsibility and choice. He did not stand before the public to beg forgiveness, nor did he demand sympathy. He simply let consistency in action speak for itself, continuing to show up for his family, continuing to contribute to the baseball community in quieter ways, and continuing to slow down so as not to repeat old cycles. In the way Chipper faced his legacy, there were no grand declarations, only quiet steadfastness. What was done cannot be undone, what was wrong is owned, and what remains is lived with decency. It is precisely that refusal to run that gives his legacy its weight, because it sends a hard-to-hear but necessary message in a culture that worships victory. Success does not exempt responsibility, and fame does not erase consequences. Chipper Jones did not become a legend because he was perfect, but because he accepted imperfection without using it as an excuse to give up. He allowed the memory of himself to exist with all its cracks, because only in that way can those who come after understand that the path to glory always demands choices, and choices always carry a price to be paid. That legacy is not glamorous, not easy to tell, but enduring. It teaches that courage lies not only in standing in decisive moments on the field, but also in standing still before the mirror when the cheers have died, naming mistakes correctly, and living the rest of life more honestly. In a world that prefers neatly rounded stories, Chipper left a jagged but true one, where legend is not built by covering wounds, but by letting wounds exist as evidence of responsibility and belated maturity. At age 53, Chipper Jones no longer lives to the rhythm of seasons, but to the slow and melancholy rhythm of a body that always requires negotiation every time the day begins. Each morning upon waking is not a moment of recharging energy, but a careful process of probing. Will the back allow him to stand straight right away today, or need a few minutes of waiting? Will the knees handle the stairs or require holding the railing? Are the joints stiff enough to make putting on a shirt a small challenge? There is no longer the bell for practice, no schedule forcing the body to adapt. Instead, there are clear, non-negotiable limits that can no longer be overcome by willpower as before. Chipper cannot run, cannot play the heavy sports that were once instinct, and every wrong movement can trigger a lingering ache that lasts for hours. This reality lacks drama, has no climax, but it is persistent and ruthless in its own way, because it repeats every day, reminding him that past sacrifices have become the conditions of the present. He is forced to accept limits, not as surrender, but as a new form of discipline, the discipline of preservation rather than conquest. If discipline once meant waking early to train, enduring pain to play, now it means stopping at the right time, not pushing the body beyond its remaining capacity, learning to say no to activities the heart still wants but the body no longer permits. Living slowly amid constant pain does not bring a heroic feeling. It demands profound humility, because every passing day is a lesson in letting go of things that once defined him. Chipper learned to find value in smaller things, a morning not too painful to allow a short walk, a day without strong painkillers, an evening alert enough to talk with family. Victories now go unrecorded, have no audience, no scorecard, but they matter in a quiet way, because each one keeps life from sliding fully into exhaustion and despair. There are moments when memories of speed, strength, the feeling of commanding the body return like a wave, and in those moments sorrow seeps in, not fierce but deep, because he knows those things will not come back. Instead of resisting, Chipper chooses acceptance, not because he has weakened, but because he has learned that preserving what remains of his health is the only way to live the rest of his life fully. This acceptance did not come immediately. It was the result of many times pushing too far, and paying the price of nights of aching that made sleep fragile, and of realizing that willpower, no matter how strong, cannot substitute for bodily wholeness. At age 53, Chipper Jones's life is no longer measured by achievements, but by the ability to maintain a fragile balance between activity and rest, between desire and reality. It is a melancholy present, but not hopeless, because in that slowing down he found another kind of peace, not from victory, but from knowing when to stop. Living by the discipline of preservation brings no sense of glory, but it allows him to keep showing up, to keep being a father, to keep living with his legacy without paying any further exorbitant price. And in that context, every day that passes, though full of negotiation and pain, is still a day lived more fully than trying to prove something he proved long ago. When the story closes, Chipper Jones does not stand on a new peak, nor does he step into the light of a final redemptive victory. He stands in silence, where all the noise has fallen away, where there is no scorecard to judge right and wrong, and where greatness is no longer measured by what people see, but by what one person has endured without running. There is no final win to lighten the years already paid for, no late miracle to fully heal a worn-out body, and no neatly rounded conclusion to a journey that was never smooth. What remains is an American man carrying the legacy of absolute dedication and the irrecoverable price of it. Chipper Jones's greatness does not lie in overcoming every pain to keep winning, but in accepting that some pains cannot be overcome in the traditional sense, they can only be lived with honestly. He did not try to hide the wear of his body, did not repaint his personal mistakes, and did not demand to be remembered as a perfect model. Instead, he let his story exist with the full weight of the choices made, the sacrifices performed, and the consequences borne. In a culture that often honors results over process, Chipper represents a hard truth. Sometimes the price of greatness does not end with the career, but stretches across the rest of life. He played when not healed, lived under pressure when not ready, and shouldered personal responsibility without moral shelter. Each decision left its mark, and in the end he did not ask to have them erased. Honoring in silence is not evasion of judgment, but acknowledgement that some people have fulfilled their duties so completely that nothing remains to justify. Chipper Jones was not fully redeemed by induction, by legacy, or by fond fan memories. He was shaped by the ability to stand firm when all those things had served their purpose. In that silence, there is no promise of complete happiness, but there is the peace of a man who knows he has paid enough for the path chosen. That peace is not comfortable, not romantic, but steeped in fatigue and clarity. He no longer chases proof of anything, needs no more titles for confirmation, because what needed proving was written in time, in pain, and in persistent presence when he could have let go. If anything deserves honor, it is not perfection, but ultimate honesty with himself. A man who did not run when his body betrayed him, did not run when his private life shattered, and did not run when silence forced him to face the hardest things to accept. Chipper Jones ends the story not with a victory, but with a different kind of standing tall, standing still, slowly, and taking responsibility for his entire journey. And in that stance there are no cheers, only deep respect for a man who understood that greatness, in the end, is not what spares us suffering, but what compels us to face it without losing dignity. The story of Chipper Jones does not just make people bow to his achievements, it forces them into silence over the price he paid to achieve them. The greatest pity lies in the paradox running through the story. A person taught from childhood that silence is discipline, endurance is duty, and worth is measured only by results. That explains why Chipper accepted playing with chronic back pain, deteriorating knees, recurring strains and tears, delaying surgery just to not leave the team behind. Those decisions made him MVP, World Series champion, the loyal icon of the Atlanta Braves, but at the same time sowed the seeds for a present where every morning at age 53 is a negotiation with his own body. The tragedy does not stop at the physical. His first marriage collapsed in silence because Chipper did not know how to be emotionally present. The moral mistake with the child born out of wedlock became the deepest cut, because he did not evade it, but also could not fully forgive himself. Upon retirement, the silence, once a refuge, became the enemy, forcing him to face emptiness, regret, and lost years. Even the Hall of Fame, the moment America honored him, arrived when his body was already broken, making the glory belated and incomplete. The lesson this story sends to real American life is not to sacrifice more, but to know when to stop at the right time. A culture that glorifies working to exhaustion, enduring pain for success, can create legends, but it can also leave people living the rest of their lives in limitation and regret. Chipper Jones deserves honor not because he was perfect, but because he did not run from the consequences of himself. And that is a profound reminder. Success only truly matters when it does not force us to lose health, family, and the ability to live fully when the lights go out. If Chipper Jones's story makes you pause and rethink the real price of greatness, please hit subscribe to keep joining us on these honest and painful journeys behind the glow of sports glory. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to honor great people, not because they were perfect, but because they did not run when it came time to pay the price.